It was the wind that wore a man down. Not the sun, not the lack of rain, but the wind. It was a living thing in the Wyoming territory, an unseen wolf that gnawed day and night at the red rock faces of Painted Rock Ranch. It was spring, 1878. But spring here only meant the snow was gone, replaced by a grit that got in a man's teeth and stayed there. The ranch was a joke, and Gideon Marr knew it. The name was grand, painted on a warped board by his father a lifetime ago. But the reality was 200 acres of stubborn dirt, a cabin that listed to the north, a barn that looked one good storm away from giving up, and fences that were more holes than wood. Gideon sat on the porch, which was just 3 warped planks laid over stacked stones. He was a man built like the landscape, stripped down to essentials, thin, sun-baked, with a quiet that was often mistaken for slowness. It was not slowness, it was patience. He was mending a saddle, not because it was his favorite, but because it was his only one. He was pulling a whittled-down awl through the thick leather, his knuckles scarred and split. When the sound came, it was wrong. Not the steady, confident hoofbeat of a traveler or the hurried rhythm of a man with purpose. This was a stumbling, dragging gait, a horse in its last moments of trying. Gideon's hand stopped, the awl halfway through the leather. He listened. The wind died for a second, as if holding its breath. Then came the crash, a heavy, wet sound, a body hitting the soft earth of the drainage ditch that marked the edge of his pitiful yard. He was on his feet, the old saddle forgotten. He moved low and fast, grabbing the caplock rifle that leaned, always loaded, by the door. He peered around the corner of the cabin. There was a horse, a bay mare, ribs showing, lathered in sweat and foam, its head hanging so low its nose touched the dirt. It was trembling, its legs splayed. And in the ditch, a heap of brown cloth and dust. He scanned the ridgeline. Nothing, no pursuers, just the wind, starting up again. He approached the ditch slowly. The rifle held steady. The person was small, wearing men's trousers and a duster coat stiff with grime. He nudged the shoulder with the rifle barrel. A groan. A woman. Gideon lowered the rifle. He knelt. Her hair was matted with dirt and something dark and wet. He turned her over. She was young, maybe 25. Her face was pale under the streaks of mud. Her lips cracked and blue. A dark stain spread from her left shoulder, and another, larger one bloomed on her side, just above the hip. She was clutching a small leather pouch against her stomach, a strap wrapped tight around her wrist, her knuckles white even in unconsciousness. Her grip was so tight it looked like the pouch had grown there, a part of her. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, a whiskey brown color. They tried to find him. "Please," she whispered, a sound like dry leaves skittering. Then she went limp, her head falling back. She fainted before she could say a name. Gideon stood there. He looked at the woman. He looked at his broken-down fence. He looked at the sky, which promised nothing but more wind. A stranger was trouble. A wounded stranger was a death sentence. He was salt poor. He measured his life in coffee beans and cartridges. He had 2 sacks of flour and a small keg of salted beef to last him until summer. This woman would need food. She would need medicine he did not have. She would bring whatever hunted her right to his door. He should have dragged her behind the rocks, left her for the buzzards. It was the smart play. It was the Wyoming play. He sighed. The sound was ripped from his chest by the wind. He cursed. A short, sharp word. He was a fool. He slid his arms under her, one beneath her knees, one behind her back. She was light, too light, but her grip on that leather pouch did not loosen, even now. He grunted as he stood, his back twinging in protest. The mare in the yard gave a low, shuddering neigh and collapsed onto its side, legs kicking weakly. He carried the woman inside. The cabin was 1 room, a cot, a table, a cold fireplace, and a small, makeshift shrine on a crate in the corner. A faded tintype of a smiling woman and a dried sprig of rosemary. He laid the stranger on his own cot, the only soft thing he owned. The straw mattress rustled beneath her weight. For a second, he just looked at her, at the absolute mess she had brought into his quiet, hard life. Then he went to work. He built up the fire, using his precious, hoarded wood. He put the big kettle on to boil. He took his sharpest skinning knife and sliced the duster coat and the blood-soaked shirt away from her body. The wounds were ugly. The one on her shoulder was a clean shot, in and out. But the one on her side, she was lucky. It looked like a bullet had glanced off a rib, tearing a long, ragged gash. It was bleeding sluggishly. It was the bleeding inside he worried about. He had no laudanum, no doctor's tools. He had a spool of thick twine, meant for mending feed sacks, and a curved needle he used for leather. He went to the table, and with the patience of a man who owned nothing but time, he began to unbraid a length of twine. He separated the strands, one by one, until he had a thin, strong, and terribly rough thread. He boiled the needle and the thread in the kettle, along with a handful of dried sage he kept for his chest colds. He washed the wounds first, the steaming, sage-scented water turning a sickening pink. She stirred, moaning, but did not wake. "Hold on, ma'am," he muttered, mostly to himself. "This ain't gonna be pleasant." He threaded the needle. He knelt by the cot. The firelight threw huge, dancing shadows on the walls. He took her skin in his calloused fingers and pushed the needle through. She screamed, a raw, animal sound that made the hair on his neck stand up. Her back arched off the cot, and her free hand flew up. Grabbing his wrist, her eyes snapped open, wild with pain, but they were not seeing him. "No," she gasped. "No, Kincaid, you can't." Then she collapsed back, unconscious again. Gideon's hand was shaking. "Kincaid, Sheriff Mort Kincaid, over in Ash Mesa." He pushed the thought away. He had a job to finish. He sewed up the gash on her side, his stitches clumsy but tight, the twine looking like railroad tracks on her pale skin. He did the shoulder last. He bandaged her with strips torn from his only clean shirt. He sat back on his heels. His forehead was beaded with sweat. The cabin was hot and close, smelling of blood, sage, and fear. The woman, Cassidy Vale, though he did not know her name yet, was breathing. It was shallow, but it was steady. He looked at the pouch, still strapped to her wrist. He needed to clean her, and it was in the way. He carefully worked the strap, his fingers brushing against her skin. It was hot. The fever was already setting in. The pouch was heavy for its size, oiled leather, stitched with care. He held it in his hand. Whatever was in here was what got her shot. It was the source of the trouble now sleeping on his cot. He walked over to the makeshift shrine. He knelt, lifted a loose floorboard that moaned in protest, and looked into the dark space beneath. It held his father's watch and his wife's wedding band. He placed the leather pouch beside them and replaced the board. Whatever it was safe. For now. He spent the rest of the night sitting in his one chair, the rifle across his knees, feeding the fire, and listening to two things: the woman's ragged breathing and the wind. Outside, the sandstorm had arrived. It was not a storm. It was a siege. The wind screamed, a high-pitched, maddening sound. Sand and small pebbles battered the cabin walls like fistfuls of shot. It was a sound that warned of bad things. It was a sound to bury secrets and to bring new dangers. As the woman on the cot tossed and turned, her lips cracking as she muttered in her fever. Gideon thought about Ash Mesa. The town was 30 miles east, a speck of civilization he avoided. But the rumors reached him, carried by the same wind. Rumors of the railroad changing its route, cutting through lands that had been promised to settlers. Rumors of Sheriff Mort Kincaid, a man who had arrived with nothing, suddenly buying up land, his pockets deep, his smile thin, his deputies hard-eyed and quick on the draw. The woman had said Kincaid's name. The fever took her deep. She was in a place he could not reach, fighting battles he could not see, but her words, fragmented and sharp, cut through the howl of the storm. The evidence, proof, can't let him. "A whole town," she breathed, her voice suddenly clear. "He'll swallow a whole town." Gideon put another log on the fire. The flames lit her face. She was not a beauty, not in the way of the saloon girls in Laramie. Her features were too strong, her chin too stubborn, but there was something in her face, even in sleep, that matched the landscape, something unbroken. The storm died with the moon. The sun rose on a world scrubbed raw, the air tasting of dust. The bay mare was dead in the yard. Gideon dragged it a quarter-mile from the cabin, a grim task that soured his stomach. He spent the day moving. He fixed the fence where the mare had fallen. He checked his snares. He rationed a small amount of oatmeal, boiling it with water until it was a thin gruel, and forced a few spoonfuls between the woman's lips. She swallowed, but did not wake. Night fell again. The silence after the storm was louder than the wind had been. Gideon did not light the lamp. He sat in the dark, watching the shadows pool in the corners. That was when he heard it, the soft jingle of a bridle, the creak of saddle leather. He was at the window in a heartbeat, the rifle in his hands. He peered through a crack in the wooden shutter. Riders, 4 of them. They were sitting their horses just outside his broken fence line, dark shapes against a sky thick with stars. They were not talking. They were just watching his dark, silent cabin. Gideon's heart was a cold stone in his chest. He could not make them out. They were just men, silhouettes of malice. One of them dismounted. He walked to the fence, knelt, and seemed to inspect the ground near the ditch where the woman had fallen. He stayed there for a long minute, then stood, walked back to his horse, mounted up, and with a low murmured word, the 4 of them turned their horses and rode away. They moved as one, silent as ghosts, disappearing into the blackness. Gideon waited. He counted to 500. He did not move. He did not breathe. When he was sure they were gone, he slipped outside. He moved to the fence. The ground was hard, but the man had been looking at the one patch of soft earth near the ditch. Gideon struck a match. The small flare of light was dangerously bright. He cupped it with his hand. There, in the dirt, was the print. A horseshoe. But it was not a normal shoe. One side was a standard curve. The other was a straight bar, ending in a sharp, wicked-looking hook. The sign of the High Plains bounty hunters. Men who hunted other men for money, and who were not particular about bringing them in alive. Gideon dropped the match, crushing it under his boot. He walked back to the cabin, his steps heavy. He bolted the door, a piece of wood that would not stop a determined child, let alone men like that. He turned, his back to the door, and let his eyes adjust to the dark. He could feel the woman's presence in the room. The cost of his foolish, soft heart. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into near total blackness, the only light coming from the dying red embers in the fireplace. He gripped the old cap-lock rifle, the wood smooth and familiar in his sweaty palms. He was a rancher, not a gunman, but a man defends his home. And in the silence, from the cot, a new sound, the rustle of the blanket. He swung the rifle toward the sound, his thumb finding the hammer. "Don't!" a voice whispered. It was not the voice of a fever dreamer. It was sharp, cold, and wide awake. In the dim red glow from the embers, Gideon Marr saw the stranger, Cassidy Vale, sitting up. Her bandages were a pale slash in the dark. She was staring right at him. Her eyes, clear now, were as sharp and as deadly as a honed blade. The stalemate held for 10 seconds. Gideon's rifle was steady, aimed at the center of the cot. The woman, Cassidy, he would learn did not move. The only things that moved were her eyes, scanning the dark room, cataloging the exits, the table, the cold fireplace, and him. "Who's outside?" she asked. Her voice was a dry rasp, but it held a steel that had been absent in her fevered mutters. "Bounty hunters," Gideon said, not lowering the rifle. "By their tracks. They left." "They'll be back." It was not a question. She pushed the heavy blanket off, her movements stiff. She tried to swing her legs over the side of the cot and gasped. A sharp intake of breath as the stitches in her side pulled. Her hand flew to the bandage. "I sewed you up," Gideon said, his voice flat. "With sack twine. It's all I had." She looked at her side, then at him. Her eyes were sharp, judging. "You have water," he nodded, finally lowering the rifle and resting its butt on the floor. He walked to the water bucket, his back to her, and knew it was a test. He heard the cot creak, the sound of her bare feet hitting the cold dirt floor. He turned, holding a dipper of water. She was standing, but she was leaning heavily on the cot. She had already pulled the door's bolt bar back and was peering through a crack in the shutter, the reflexes of a hunted thing. "You're at Painted Rock Ranch," he said, 30 miles from Ash Mesa. "My name is Gideon Marr." She took the dipper from him, her hand shaking from the effort. Not the fear. She drank, greedily, the water spilling down her chin. She handed it back, her eyes never leaving his. "They'll burn you out for this? For the water? For the thread? Who are they?" She ignored the question. "The pouch." Her voice was a sudden command, sharp with panic. Her free hand flew to her wrist, where the strap had been. "Where is it?" "Safe," Gideon said. "Under the floor, under my wife's memory." Her eyes softened, just for a second. The panic receded, replaced by a cold assessment. She trusted the floorboard more than she trusted him. "I need it. You need to lie down." "You're bleeding again." He was right. A small, dark spot was already weeping through the clean shirt bandage on her shoulder. She looked at the stain, annoyed, as if her own body had betrayed her. She stumbled back to the cot and sat hard. "My horse, dead," Gideon said. "Had to drag her out." A shadow passed over her face. It was the first true emotion he had seen from her, a flash of grief that was deeper than her own pain. She closed her eyes. "Her name was Bess." She took a deep, shuddering breath, which she regretted instantly, her face tightening. "Thank you for the thread." She was Cassidy Vale. She told him her name as the sun rose, painting the dusty cabin in shades of gray and pale yellow. She was, or had been, a clerk for the Northern Wyoming Mining Ore Company. She was good with figures, too good. The story came out in jagged pieces, like shards of a broken bottle. She spoke as she inspected his stitch work, her expression grimly professional as she dabbed at the weeping wound with a cloth dipped in the cold, sage-scented water. "There was a payroll," she said, her voice low. "For the men at the Sweetwater mine, $50,000, gold." She paused, listening to the cabin settle, to the wind picking up outside. It was robbed, not by road agents. It was an inside job. They killed the guards, blamed it on a Cheyenne raiding party. But there wasn't a single track. They just vanished it. She looked up at him, her whiskey brown eyes pinning him. "I kept the ledgers, the private ones, not the ones they showed the inspectors." She'd seen the discrepancies, payments, small at first, then larger, consulting fees, land surveys, security details, all paid out to accounts that did not exist, all approved by the mine supervisor, Silas Rudd, and all co-signed, with a peculiar flourish, by someone listed only as MK. "I was a fool," she hissed, more to herself than to him. "I thought it was just skimming. I went to Rudd. I showed him the numbers. I asked him to explain." Her face went pale. He smiled. "He told me I was a very observant girl, and that my cooperation in the robbery would be rewarded." They had set her up. The day of the robbery, Rudd had sent her on an errand to the payroll office, a place she never went. He had her sign for a box of new ledgers. She had been seen, by witnesses, handling the empty payroll boxes just an hour before they were supposedly filled and sent out. She was the accomplice, the woman robber who had given the inside information. "I ran," she said. "I knew what was next. I went back to the office that night. I took the real ledger, the black one, and I took the other thing." "The pouch," Gideon said. She nodded. "They caught up to me at the Wind River crossing. It was not a robbery. It was an execution. They shot Bess out from under me. I just ran south. I don't know how I got here." She leaned her head back against the cabin's rough-hewn logs. exhausted. "They're not hunting a thief. Mr. Marr, they're hunting a witness." The tension in the cabin was so thick he could taste it, like iron. He was part of this now. The men with the hook-shaped horseshoes were not just bounty hunters. They were assassins. He made a decision. He walked to the shrine, knelt, and pulled up the creaking floorboard. He reached into the dark space and pulled out the oiled leather pouch. He held it for a moment. It felt warm. He turned and handed it to her. Her fingers closed around it. The relief that flooded her face was total. She held it to her chest, like a mother holding a newborn. "What's in it?" Gideon asked. "That's worth this much blood." She untied the leather strap, her fingers clumsy but determined. She unrolled the pouch. It was not a bag. It was a roll, designed to keep papers flat and dry. "It's not just the ledger," she said, her voice dropping. The ledger just shows the greed." Inside, wrapped in a sheet of stiff, waxed cloth, were 2 items. The first was a sheaf of papers, covered in her neat, precise handwriting, columns of names, dates, and figures. Down the side, she had pressed impressions of several different wax seals into the paper itself. "Rudd seal," she said, pointing to one. "The mining companies." Then she pointed to another, a simple eagle clutching an arrow. "And is Sheriff Kincaid. M.K., Mort Kincaid." "This," she said, her finger tracing a line from a date to a figure, "is the $5,000 paid to Kincaid, the day before he legally seized the Miller farm for back taxes, taxes the Millers had already paid." Gideon felt his stomach clench. He knew the Millers. Good people, broken by that seizure. "And here," she continued, "is the payment for the security that ran the Shoshone off the Broken Horn Reservation. And here is the money for the land concessions, for the railroad." She then pulled out the second item. It was a map, not a hand-drawn sketch, but an official-looking blueprint, stained and creased. "Rudd was drunk," she said. "He was bragging. He unrolled this, the new railroad route, the one the government doesn't even know about yet." Gideon took the map. His hands, calloused and hard, trembled slightly. He unrolled it on the cot between them. The blue line of the proposed railroad track was a snake. It was supposed to go through Ash Mesa, but on this map, it bypassed the town completely, veering 30 miles south, right through the fertile valley of the Sweetwater, right through the seized Miller farm, right through the lands Kincaid had been buying for pennies on the dollar. And in the margins, in a neat hand, were notations. "Seize for security. RR. Condemn unstable. Offer $1 acre." His eyes traced the line, his blood turning to ice. The line ran less than a mile from his own property. His ranch, Painted Rock, was marked with a simple, chilling word, annex. He had not just saved a witness. He was holding the motive for the theft of an entire valley. "You need to rest," Gideon said, his voice thick. He folded the map and handed it back. "I'm going to town. I need supplies." Cassidy's eyes narrowed. "Town, Ash Mesa," you're walking into his arms. "I look like I do every month," Gideon said, pulling his hat down. "A man looking for salt and coffee. I'll be back by dark." He was lying. He needed to know what Kincaid was saying. He needed to know how much time they had. The ride to Ash Mesa was fast. He pushed his old mule, feeling the eyes of the hills on him. The town was quiet. Too quiet. The usual bustle of prospectors and ranchers was gone. There was a tension in the air, the same coiled snake feeling he had on his ranch. He tied his mule outside the general store and went in. But his real destination was the bathhouse and saloon, run by Nora Pike. Nora was a woman who had seen everything. She was wide, weathered, and had a mind sharper than any razor. She was washing glasses, her back to the empty room. As Gideon slid onto a stool, "You're a fool for being here. Gideon," she said, not turning around. "Need coffee. Nora, you need a hole to crawl into," she said, turning. Her eyes were dark with worry. "Heard you had a visitor last night. 4 of them. Didn't even stop for a drink. Just rode through, asking questions." They find anything? Gideon kept his voice level. They found that bay mare of yours, the new one. Gideon's heart hammered. He did not have a new bay mare. Cassidy did. Then Kincaid himself rode through, Nora said, leaning in, her voice dropping to a whisper. Not an hour ago. He was cheerful. That's the part that scares me. She polished a glass, her knuckles white. He's telling everyone he's hunting the woman who led the payroll robbery. Says she was wounded, disguised as a man. Says she's armed and dangerous, and that she was last seen heading toward Painted Rock. The blood drained from Gideon's face. It was a public announcement. A warrant. He's coming for you, Gideon, Nora whispered. He's not sending those hooked shoe bastards. He's coming himself to apprehend a dangerous criminal who just happens to be on your land. He's got his excuse to be there. Gideon threw 2 coins on the bar. For the coffee. Gideon, she said, grabbing his wrist. Her hand was strong. Don't you die for nothing. He was back at the ranch in 2 hours. The mule lathered. Cassidy was on the porch, a pale ghost, his own rifle in her lap. She had seen him coming. He's coming, Gideon said, swinging off the mule. He's made you a public enemy. He'll be here to arrest you. Then we have to leave, she said, struggling to her feet. Now, I can ride. You can't even stand. Gideon shot back. We run now. You'll be dead in a day. He'll have his escaped prisoner, shot while fleeing, and the map will be buried with you. Then what? She cried, her voice breaking. We wait for him to kill us both. Gideon did not answer. He walked past her, into the barn. He grabbed a fork and began pulling down the driest hay from the loft, piling it in the empty stall nearest the door. A false fire, a decoy. He then went behind the cabin, to the collapsed ruin of his father's old grist mill. He kicked aside the broken wheel and began pulling at the stones of the foundation. Behind it was a dark hole, the old root cellar. It was shallow, but it led 20 yards. Opening out into the ditch where she had fallen, she had followed him. She stood there, wrapped in his blanket, watching. He's watched us, Gideon said, his voice tight, pulling another stone loose. He's been watching since last night. He knows I'm poor. He knows I'm alone. He thinks I'm weak. Gideon! He's coming, Gideon said, turning to face her. The sun was getting low, painting the red rocks in blood. But he'll come when I'm ready. That's madness, she said. You're one man, with one rifle. He needs you. He needs that map. He won't just start shooting. He looked at the bandages on her side. How long? What? The wounds. How long until the stitches hold, until you can ride? Really ride? She considered, her mind clicking like a telegraph key. 3 days, maybe 4, if the fever stays down. 3 days, Gideon said. It was a death sentence. It was a plan. He can have his warrant. He can have his authority. He'll come, and we won't be here. But we're not running. Not yet. She looked at him, at the set of his jaw. He was no longer the quiet, patient man who mended saddles. He was a man with a line drawn around his home. 3 days. She agreed, her voice barely a whisper. He gave her a curt nod and went back to the cellar. The plan was thin, brittle as a dry leaf. But it was a plan, and as the first stars pricked the purple sky, neither of them saw it. High on the ridge, a full mile away, the setting sun caught the glint of glass. A man in a black oilcloth duster, the same man who had inspected the horseshoe print, lowered a spyglass. He smiled, his teeth yellow in the fading light, and settled in to wait. The wire was pulled taut. The first day was a fever. The second was a reckoning. The third day dawned with a terrible, breathless quiet. For 2 days, Gideon and Cassidy had moved in the small cabin like 2 wary animals in a shared trap. He had boiled what little jerky he had into a thin, salty broth. He had watched her fever break, her skin going from dry and hot to cool and damp. He had watched her practice walking, her teeth gritted, her hand pressed to the twine stitches in her side. She was a fast healer, or just stubborn. He had seen the way she looked at the rifle, how she had instinctively checked the load he had put in it. She was not a victim. She was a fighter, temporarily grounded. "He'll come at noon," she said on the morning of the third day. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, lacing up an old pair of Gideon's boots, which were ridiculously large on her. "Why noon?" Gideon was on the porch, his eyes on the eastern ridge, a cup of bitter coffee in his hand. "He's a proud man," she said, her voice strained as she bent to pull a lace tight. "He wants the sun high. He wants witnesses, even if it's just the buzzards. He wants to ride in like God, not sneak in like a thief." She was right. At 11:30, the dust appeared. Not a cloud, but 3 distinct plumes, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. "Go," Gideon said, not turning. "To the cellar, now. I'm not—" "Go." His voice was not loud, but it had the crack of his rifle. "The plan. Stick to the plan. I'll make the smoke." "You get to the ditch. Get the animals. Wait for me. If I'm not there in 5 minutes, you ride. You hear me? You ride." She stared at his back, a rigid line of homespun cloth. She nodded, grabbed the rifle, and slipped behind the cabin toward the ruined grist mill. Gideon stayed on the porch. He sat back down in his chair, picked up the piece of leather he had been mending 3 days prior, and set the awl to it. He heard the jingle of bridles, the creak of leather, the thud of hooves on his dry-baked yard. He did not look up. 3 horses stopped, not 10 feet from his porch. The one in the center was a magnificent dapple gray, a charger fit for a general, its coat gleaming, its tack shining with silver conchos. The man on top matched the horse. Sheriff Mort Kincaid was not a rough-edged frontier lawman. He was clean-shaven, his mustache waxed into 2 perfect, sharp points. He wore a tailored black coat, a brocade vest, and a star that was solid silver, not tin. His smile was bright, white, and held no warmth at all. The 2 men with him were his opposites, scrappers. One was heavy, with a greasy duster and a week's worth of stubble. The other was young, twitchy, with a new-looking pistol tied low on his hip. "Gideon Marr," Kincaid said, his voice as smooth as oiled steel. He did not dismount. He looked around the ranch, taking in the broken fence, the listing barn, the man in the patched-up chair. His smile widened. "This is humble." Gideon finished pulling a stitch, his hand slow and steady. He looked up. "It's mine, Sheriff. That it is," Kincaid said, swinging a leg over. He landed with the jingle of spurs. He was tall. He walked right up to the porch, his shadow falling across Gideon. He looked at the saddle. "Hard times, Mr. Marr. Hard times can make a man do desperate things. Times are always hard. Kincaid, only the desperate change." Kincaid's smile thinned. He stroked his mustache. "I have a warrant, Marr, duly sworn, for the arrest of one Cassidy Vale, female, thief, accomplice to murder and robbery. She was seen heading this way." He unrolled a piece of paper, holding it out. Gideon did not take it. "Never heard of her." The heavy-set deputy chuckled. The young, twitchy one put his hand on his pistol. "Now, Gideon," Kincaid said, his voice still friendly, still reasonable. "We all know you're poor, Lord. We all know it." He gestured at the cabin. "But you're not stupid. You're just a man in the wrong place, harboring a fugitive. That's a federal crime. They'll take this." He sneered. "This ranch from you. You'll have nothing." He leaned in, his voice dropping. "Marr, you are entirely too poor to be getting involved in the affairs of wealthy men." It was the line, the one Gideon had been waiting for. He set the saddle piece down. He stood up. He was shorter than Kincaid, and 100 pounds lighter. But he did not back down. "Coffee," Gideon said. Kincaid blinked. "What? You're on my land. It's polite. I'll get you some coffee. Then we can talk about your warrant." Kincaid was thrown. This was not in his script. He looked at the twitchy deputy, then back at Gideon. A poor man, offering hospitality, To refuse would be an insult, and Kincaid was a man who enjoyed all the small rituals of power. "Why, that's neighborly of you, Mar," he said, the smile returning. "Don't mind if we do, boys. Wait here." Kincaid stepped up onto the porch, as if he owned it. Gideon backed into the cabin, his mind racing. He was stalling. He needed 1 minute. He moved to the fireplace, where a pot of mud-thin coffee was kept perpetually warm. He grabbed the potholder. "She's not in there, is she?" "Mar!" Kincaid's voice came from the doorway. He was looking around the one-room cabin, his lip curled at the sparse, clean poverty. "Hiding under the cot." "The pot's hot," Gideon said, turning, and in that moment, the cabin door was pushed wide. Cassidy Vale stood there. She was not in the cellar. She was here. She wore Gideon's oversized boots and his blanket, draped over her shoulders like a queen's robe. Her hair was matted, her face pale, but her eyes were on fire. She was holding the rifle, though it was pointed at the floor. "You're not a very good listener," Gideon said to her, his voice low. "He's not a very good sheriff," she retorted, her eyes locked on Kincaid. Kincaid's face was a study. The smooth, neighborly mask evaporated, replaced by a flash of pure, cold fury. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a look of surprised recognition. Well, Miss Vale," he said, spreading his hands. "We've all been so worried about you." "You've been worried about this," Cassidy said, her voice shaking, but not with fear. "With rage. You're afraid of my ledger. You're afraid of the map. Ledger map." Kincaid looked genuinely confused. He turned to his deputies, who were now on the steps, their hands on their guns. "She's delirious, boys. The fever from her wounds, no doubt." He took a step toward her. "Miss Vale, you're under arrest for the robbery of the Sweetwater payroll. You're going to come with me, nice and quiet." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal shined in the dim light. "No," Gideon said. Kincaid stopped. He turned to look at Gideon, who was still standing by the fireplace, the coffee pot in his hand. "No, this is my land," Gideon said. He said it quiet. "My home. I have a warrant." Kincaid snapped, his patience gone. "It gives me the right." "You have an arrest warrant," Gideon said, his voice finding a new strength. "You do not have a search warrant." He walked to the wall, to the small, empty shrine. He reached behind the tintype of his wife and pulled out a folded, oilcloth-wrapped packet. He laid it on the table. He unfolded it. It was an old document. The ink faded, the paper thick as hide. It was signed by President Ulysses S. Grant. "A federal land patent," Gideon said. "Sealed. Proving this 200 acres. It declares this house, this cabin, a private dwelling, homesteaded. My father built it with his own hands, and under territorial law. You cannot enter a man's private, patented dwelling without his permission or a specific writ of search, which you don't have." He looked Kincaid in the eye. "You're not welcome. Sheriff, I'm asking you to leave my home." There was a perfect, ringing silence. Kincaid was staring at the land patent. He was beaten, legally, and he knew it. He knew that if he crossed that line, Gideon could shoot him, and it would be a defensive home killing that no judge in Wyoming would convict him for. The twitchy deputy, the young one, did not understand the law. He only understood the stalemate. He saw his sheriff, his powerful, rich boss, being stared down by a poor dirt rancher. "The hell with this," the deputy shouted, his nerves breaking. He yanked his pistol. "He's got the girl. Boss, let's just—" He leveled the gun at Gideon. It was the mistake they had all been waiting for. Gideon did not move toward the deputy. He did not move toward Cassidy. He threw the coffee pot, but he did not throw it at the deputy. He threw it sideways, a low, spinning disc toss. It sailed past the deputy's ear and smashed into the lantern hanging by the barn door, the one he had filled with oil that morning. In the same second, with a movement so fast it was a blur, Gideon grabbed the burning hot blow poker from the fireplace. He lunged past Kincaid, onto the porch, and jammed the glowing red tip into the massive pile of dry as tinder hay he had stacked in the stall. The result was not a fire. It was an explosion. The oil from the lantern ignited with a whoosh. The dry hay, piled for 3 days, went up in a solid wall of yellow-white flame and thick, choking smoke. The horses screamed. The dapple gray, a high-strung, expensive animal, reared, striking the twitchy deputy in the chest, sending him flying. The heavy-set deputy's horse bolted, yanking the reins from his hand. Kincaid, blinded by smoke, was left standing on the porch, his hand on his own gun, with no one to shoot at. "Now!" Gideon roared. He grabbed Cassidy around the waist, lifting her clean off her feet. He ignored her pained cry as he half-dragged, half-carried her around the side of the cabin, toward the grist mill. "The cellar move!" He practically threw her into the dark hole behind the millstone and dove in after her, pulling the broken wheel back into place. They scrambled through the dark, damp, spider-filled tunnel, Gideon pushing her from behind. They burst out into the sunlight of the ditch, gasping, their ears ringing. "You were supposed to be here." Gideon yelled, dragging her to her feet. "You were supposed to be faster," she yelled back. His old mule and his one good pack horse were tied to a rock, saddled and waiting. He threw Cassidy onto the horse, not bothering with grace, and scrambled onto the mule. From the yard, they heard Kincaid's voice, roaring in pure, unadulterated fury. "They're in the barn. Find them, shoot the horses." A gunshot cracked, and a bullet zipped over their heads. Gideon slapped the rump of Cassidy's horse. "Ride north to the wind notch, go!" They plunged down the ditch, using it for cover, then burst out onto the plain, 2 desperate figures on mismatched animals, riding low and fast. They cleared the first ridge. Gideon chanced to look back. His world was on fire. The barn was a column of black smoke. The fire had leaped to the dry grass and was already catching the side of his cabin. Through the smoke, he could see 3 figures. Kincaid was standing in the yard, his coat off, his face black with soot. He was not looking for them. He was watching his men try to save their own horses. Then Kincaid looked up. He saw them, 2 small specks on the ridge. He raised his fist. His voice was too far away to be heard, but his meaning was clear, carried on the wind with the ash of Gideon's life. He vowed he would tear down Painted Rock. He would salt the earth. He was not a sheriff now. He was a man whose pride had been wounded, whose power had been challenged by a poor man and a slip of a girl. Gideon Marr had just lost his home. He turned his mule north and rode. They did not run. They fled. There is a difference. Running is a choice. Fleeing is a desperate, lung-burning animal instinct. Gideon's mule was sure-footed but slow. Cassidy's pack horse was terrified, still smelling the smoke and fighting the bit. Gideon grabbed its lead. Yanking the animal into line, they left the plain and plunged into the high-country canyons, a maze of red rock and stunted juniper that he knew better than Kincaid's men ever could. He did not look back again. He knew what he would see: the black column that had been his barn, and the greasy smoke that had been his home, his past, his father's legacy. He had traded it all for a woman he did not know, for a map that had just made him a pauper. "Where are we going?" Cassidy shouted over the clatter of hooves on stone. She was riding low, one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other pressed tight to her side. "Wind notch," he yelled back. "It's a shortcut, a bad one. It'll take us over the ridge by nightfall." It was, in truth, a goat path, a narrow fissure in the earth, barely wide enough for a single horse, that climbed steeply toward the sky. They dismounted, Gideon leading the mule, which took the climb with stubborn protest, and Cassidy pulling the horse, her face a mask of pale, sweat-sheen determination. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue, was turning. To the west, a bank of clouds the color of a fresh bruise was building, stacking on top of itself with an unnatural speed. "No," Gideon muttered, looking up. "Not now." The wind changed. It stopped being the steady Wyoming breeze and became a cold, wet blast that carried a new sound, a sound like 1,000 tiny hammers. It started with a few clicks on the rocks. Then the air turned white. "Hail!" Gideon roared, grabbing the mule's bridle. It was not hail. It was a biblical plague, ice stones, some as large as his thumb. Hammered them without mercy. The animal screamed, the mule trying to rear, the horse pulling back, its eyes white with terror. Under the overhang, Gideon yelled, pointing to a shallow scoop in the canyon wall 20 yards ahead. He dragged the mule forward, the ice striking his hat, his shoulders, his hands, with a force that felt like being beaten. Cassidy stumbled behind him, her blanket held over her head. The horse she was leading shied violently, pulling the rope from her grasp. "No!" she screamed. The horse, mad with pain, bolted, scrambling back down the narrow canyon. Cassidy lunged for the rope. She missed, her oversized boots slipping on a slick, ice-covered rock. She went down, hard. She did not fall onto the path. She fell against the jagged canyon wall, her wounded left side taking the full, brutal impact. She did not make a sound. She simply crumpled, a heap of wet blanket and stolen boots. "Leave the horse," Gideon bellowed. He dove for her, dragging her the last few feet into the shallow shelter of the overhang. The mule, smarter than the horse, crowded in behind them, trembling, its coat already streaked with welts. The storm raged. It was a fury trapped in the canyon, the ice roaring with the sound of a runaway train. They were soaked in seconds, the temperature plummeting. Gideon knelt beside Cassidy. She was on her hands and knees, her head hanging, her body shaking. I'm all right," she panted, the words a lie. "You're not." Gideon's voice was flat. He looked at her side. The blanket was dark. The old shirt underneath was darker. The twine stitches, his clumsy, desperate work, had held. The flesh around them had not. The fall had torn the wound open, wide and deep. She was bleeding. She was bleeding a lot. The storm outside was a killer. The wound in here was a killer. "Stay here," he said, his voice a command. He unstrapped the pack from the mule, his hands already stiffening, his knuckles split and bleeding from the ice. He pulled out a dry blanket, his flint and steel, and a small, canvas-wrapped bundle, his fishing tackle. He wrapped the dry blanket around her shoulders. She was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering, a rhythmic click, click, click in the roar of the storm. I have to stop it," he said. He did not know how to be gentle. He only knew how to be practical. She knew what he meant. She looked at his face, at the grim set of his jaw. She nodded once, her eyes squeezing shut. He built a tiny fire, a handful of dry twigs and a piece of oilcloth he kept in his tackle. It was a pathetic, smoky thing, but it was fire. He unwrapped the canvas roll. He did not take a needle. He took his largest, sturdiest iron fish hook. He held the hook in the flame, using his pliers from the mule's tack box to grip it. The metal turned from black to gray, then to a dull, cherry red. Cassidy was watching, her eyes wide. She had stopped shivering. She was biting her lower lip. So hard a bead of blood welled up, bright against her pale skin. "This is—" Gideon started. "Do it," she hissed. "Do it before you lose your nerve." He knelt. He pulled the torn shirt away. The wound was a gaping, ugly mouth. He could see the pale white of her rib. He looked at her face. "Don't scream, no matter what. Sound carries in these canyons. Bite this." He shoved a folded piece of his leather glove into her hand. She put it between her teeth. He put his left hand on her hip, pinning her against the rock wall. He brought the glowing hook to her side. The smell was the worst. The instant, sick, sweet smell of cooking meat. A wisp of gray smoke rose from the wound. Cassidy's whole body went rigid. A low, strangled sound, half groan, half scream, was torn from her, muffled by the glove. Her fingers dug into the rock floor, her knuckles white, her eyes were screwed shut, tears streaming from them, instantly cold on her cheeks. Gideon did not stop. He worked quickly, his hands steady, his face a mask of stone. He pressed the hot iron against the bleeders, one by one, sealing the gash with fire. He was not a doctor. He was a rancher, doing what he did for sick cattle. It was over in 30 seconds. It was an eternity. He pulled the hook away, the red glow gone. He was shaking, a deep tremor in his arms. Cassidy spat the glove out. She was panting, her body slick with a new, cold sweat. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of agony and, stranger still, gratitude. You've done that before," she whispered, her voice a ruin. "Never on a person," he said. He sat back, his own strength gone, and just listened to the hail. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving a world of battered, bruised silence. The sun came out, melting the ice, turning the canyon floor into a muddy, treacherous stream. Their packhorse was gone. They had one mule, a shared blanket, and a freshly seared wound. They rested for 2 hours, Gideon letting the mule graze on the tough, wet grass. Cassidy fell into a light, exhausted doze. When she woke, the sun was warmer. She saw him inspecting the rock wall, his hand tracing something. "You're looking in the wrong place," she said, her voice weak but clear. He turned. "What?" "You're looking for tracks. You should be looking for signs." She pointed, her finger trembling, to a spot near his head. He looked. It was just a scratch. 2 arrows, carved into the stone, one on top of the other. "That's a miner's mark," she said. "My father was a prospector. He taught me." She took a breath. "Double arrow. It means good water ahead. It means we're on a real trail, not just a goat path." She leaned her head back, her strength fading. "Look for a circle, with a line through it." "What's that one?" Gideon asked, his eyes scanning the rocks. "Traitor," she whispered. "It means someone. Someone in the crew was not to be trusted. They marked the rock to warn the next man. A new language, a secret code, written on the face of the earth. He was a rancher. He read the land in wind and grass. She read it in scratches and symbols. They moved on, Gideon walking, Cassidy riding the mule. It was slow. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain through her, but she did not complain. She just held onto the saddle, her face pale, her eyes scanning the rocks. Night found them on a high bluff. They were cold, hungry, and exposed. His ranch, his life, was a pinprick of smoke on the horizon, miles away. He built another small, smokeless fire, and they shared the last of his jerky, which he had to chew into a paste before she could swallow it. He was staring into the darkness, toward Ash Mesa, when he saw it, far, far in the distance. A light. It blinked, once, twice. A long pause, then a third, sharp blink. "What is that?" Cassidy whispered, huddled in the blanket. Gideon felt the first flicker of something that was not despair. "That," he said, "is Nora Pike." "Nora?" "She runs the saloon. She was my mother's friend." He watched the signal again. 1, 2, 3. "We had a signal from when I was a boy. If I ever got lost. 3 blinks. It means safe. It means come." He looked at Cassidy. "And that's not just a signal. That's a direction. She's not in Ash Mesa. She's at Box Elder Gulch, the old, abandoned smithy." Hank called her. Cassidy breathed, her mind sharp, connecting the pieces. "The blacksmith in town. The one who looked at me like I was a ghost." "He's a friend," Gideon said. "Nora must have gotten to him. The signal means they're there. They're waiting." Hope was a dangerous, heavy thing. It felt strange. At dawn, they did not head for the smithy. That was what Kincaid would expect. Gideon looked at the sun, then at the shallow, muddy creek that flowed from the melted hail. "This way," he said, tugging the mule. That's downstream." Cassidy said, confused. "The gulch is north. Kincaid's not a fool." Gideon said, "He'll have trackers. Maybe those hooked shoe men. They'll find where our horse bolted. They'll follow us, unless we don't leave a trail." He led the mule straight into the creek. The water was knee-deep, the bottom a thick, stinking mud. "Alkali," he said, his nose wrinkling. "Good. It'll burn our tracks in the scent." We'll follow this 5, maybe 6 miles, then we cut back. They spent the morning in the water. It was cold, miserable work. The mud sucked at Gideon's boots. The mule hated it. But it was smart. As they rode, Cassidy finally told him the rest, the part she had left out. "It's not just Kincaid," she said, her voice a monotone, her eyes on the brown water. "He's just the muscle, the man who files the papers and wears the badge." "Who, then?" "Silas Rudd, the mine supervisor, the man I worked for. He and Kincaid are partners." She laid it all out. The payroll robbery was not a robbery. It was a transfer of funds. Rudd stole the $50,000 from his own company. Kincaid's deputies, the robbers, collected it. That money was then used to bribe the land assessors, to pay the bounty hunters, to buy the judges. "But why?" Gideon asked. "They have the mine. They're already rich. The mine is playing out." Cassidy said, "The new vein is fool's gold. Rudd knows. He's been cooking the books for a year. He needs something new. The railroad, the land. This is his new mine. Stealing the Sweetwater Valley?" It was a conspiracy so vast, so complete. It left Gideon breathless. It was not just a crooked sheriff. It was a rot that went all the way to the top. Gideon stopped the mule. He looked at the barren, alkali-crusted banks of the creek. His father had crossed this land in a wagon. He had fought Cheyenne. He had fought the winter. He had dug in his heels and built something. A fence, a home, a life. Silas Rudd and Mort Kincaid were just a new kind of winter, a new kind of predator. "I may not be rich," Gideon said, his voice low and raw, "but I'll be damned if I'm selling the fences my ancestors built with their bare hands." Cassidy looked at him, and for the first time, she was not looking at a savior or a captor. She was looking at a partner. They left the creek in the late afternoon, climbing a rocky bank covered in cedar trees. The mule was exhausted. Gideon stopped to let it rest, to let Cassidy adjust her bandages. He was leaning against a thick-barked cedar, his eyes on their back trail, when he saw it, a small, dark star, embedded in the wood, a pockmark. He walked over. He pulled his skinning knife. He was a man who noticed things that were out of place. He dug at the wood, the knife blade scraping. After a minute, a piece of metal fell into his hand. It was a lead slug, a bullet, fired a long time ago by the looks of the scar, but it was not a normal bullet. He rubbed the grit off it. It was a .44, but the base had been filed. It was marked. A custom load. "What is it?" Cassidy asked, walking over, her steps unsteady. He held it out. She took it, turning it over in her palm. Her face went ashen. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "Kincaid. He shoots at targets behind the jail. He's proud of his marksmanship. He files his bullets. He says it gives them a bite. A little K." She pointed. There it was. A tiny, crudely scratched KA on the base. "This canyon," she said, looking around. We're near the Wind River crossing. This is where they ambushed me, where they shot Bess." Gideon looked at the tree. He looked at the bullet. He looked at the direction the bullet had come from. It was not fired at Cassidy. It was fired from the trail. This was a bullet from the payroll robbery. Kincaid had not just sent his men. He had been there. He had been shooting. He was sealing his own deal, cleaning up his own mess. Gideon closed his hand around the bullet. It was still, somehow, warm. It was not just a map anymore. It was not just a ledger. It was proof. Hard, lead proof. They traveled for another day, cutting back north, sticking to the ridges. The bullet Gideon had dug from the cedar tree was a cold, heavy weight in his pocket. It was a tangible piece of Kincaid's guilt, a physical link in the chain of evidence Cassidy carried in her head and in the oiled pouch. They saw Box Elder Gulch before they heard it. It was a scar in the earth, a place where a stream had once run, now just a dry wash lined with abandoned mining shacks. The smithy was at the far end, its chimney a broken tooth against the sky. A thin wisp of smoke, barely visible, rose from that chimney. "He's here," Cassidy whispered. relief and fear making her voice tremble. Gideon slid off the mule, his legs stiff, his back aching. He helped Cassidy down. She almost collapsed when her feet hit the ground, her strength completely gone. He supported her, his arm around her waist, her arm slung over his shoulder, and they half walked, half stumbled the last 100 yards. The smithy door creaked open before they reached it. Hank Calder filled the doorway. He was a mountain of a man, with arms as thick as wagon axles and a beard stained with soot. He did not smile. His eyes were small, dark, and missed nothing. Behind him, in the shadows, Nora Pike stood, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. "You're late," Hank grumbled, his voice like gravel. "Nora's been ringing that bell in her head for 2 nights. We had trouble," Gideon said. "We see it," Nora said, stepping aside, her eyes taking in Cassidy's pale, drawn face and the dark stains on her bandages. "Get her in, Hank. Bar the door." They brought Cassidy into the smithy. It was hot, smelling of coal smoke, iron, and horse. Nora had set up a cot in the corner, by the unlit forge. She helped Cassidy to it, easing her down. "Nora," Gideon started. "Shut up, Gideon," Nora said, not unkindly, as she bustled, pulling a clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey from a crate. "You talk later. We work now." Hank Calder did not talk. He worked. He was at his bench, his huge hands surprisingly delicate. He was holding 2 objects, small and metal. "Kincaid," Hank said, his voice flat. "He's a fool." Gideon walked over. "What's that?" Hank held up a small, intricately carved metal disc. It was an eagle, clutching an arrow. "Sheriff's seal, for all his official papers." Then he held up the second one. It was identical. "Or is this it?" "I don't understand," Gideon said. "Kincaid, he fancies himself important." Hank rumbled. "He broke his first seal. An accident. He came to me to make a new one. Said he wanted it improved. Stronger." Hank pointed to the first seal. "This is the original. The broken one. See here." He showed Gideon. In the eagle's wing, so small it was almost invisible, was a hairline fracture. "And this," Hank said, holding up the second one, "is the one I made for him. Perfect. No cracks. Smooth as a new coin." He then walked to a shelf and picked up a third object, a heavy, wax-coated block, a mold. He told me to destroy the old one. He paid me $20, silver, to forget it. But I'm a smith. Mr. Marr. I don't like destroying good work, and I don't like men who pay too much for a simple job. He looked at Gideon, his dark eyes intense. He was in a hurry. He took the new one, the perfect one. He's been using it ever since. I kept the original. Gideon stared, his mind racing. The ledger Cassidy had, the land seizures, the fraudulent papers. The papers he's been filing. Cassidy said from the cot, her voice weak but sharp. "The ones he used to steal the land. They'll have the new seal, the perfect one. But the real county seal is the broken one. He's been faking his own authority." Gideon breathed. "Every document he's signed since he got that new seal is a forgery." "Not just him," a new voice said. A small, thin woman stood in the side door, which led to the living quarters. She wore wire-rimmed spectacles and had ink stains on her fingers. She was wringing her hands, her face a knot of terror. "Sarah," Nora said, walking over. "It's all right. This is Gideon. This is the woman." "Sarah Bloom," Gideon said, recognizing her. "You run the post office." "I try," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting to the barred door. I do what I'm told, but he's been watching me." She clutched a leather mail pouch to her chest. "He told me anything for the Sweetwater mine, anything addressed to the territorial marshal in Laramie. He had to inspect it for security." She fumbled with the pouch, her hands shaking. I held these back. I was so scared. He said he'd burn the office with me in it." She pulled out a small stack of envelopes. 3 of them. Addressed to the marshal, from miners at the Sweetwater. "They're crying for help," Sarah said, tears welling. "They're talking about the payroll, about how they knew it was an inside job, about how Rudd and Kincaid were threatening their families." She held them out. "He's been stopping the mail. He's been stopping the law." Gideon took the letters. He now had the bullet. Hank had the seal. Sarah had the proof of obstruction. "But it's not enough," Nora said, her voice hard. She was standing over Cassidy, holding a small tin box. "It's his word against ours. He's the law. We're just us." "We have the ledger," Cassidy said, trying to sit up. "The original. It shows the payments." "He'll say you faked it." Nora said, "He'll say you're a bitter, lying thief. He's already plastered your name all over town." She opened the tin box. "It's a good thing you're an observant girl, but it's a better thing you're a careful one." Inside the box, there was not a ledger. There was a stack of flimsy, black-stained paper. "What is that?" Gideon asked. "It's a new thing," Nora said, a small, proud smile on her face. "My supplier in Cheyenne sent it. Carbon paper. He calls it a magic paper. You write on one sheet, and it makes a copy on the sheet below." Cassidy's eyes went wide. "Nora, you didn't. The day you started getting suspicious," Nora said. "The day you came to me asking how a man like Rudd could afford French brandy. I gave you this. I told you to use it. For inventory." Nora pulled out a sheet. It was a perfect, black-inked copy of a page from the ledger. Signatures, dates, figures. The $5,000 to Kincaid. The payments for the security. It was all there. "His word against yours," Nora said, her voice dropping. "No, girl. His word against his own. This is his own handwriting, magically copied. He can't deny this." They had it. They had the motive, the means, the cover-up, and the proof. "We go to Laramie," Cassidy said, her voice urgent. "Now, we take this to the marshal. We can end this. And get shot in the back by Kincaid's men before we're 10 miles out of town," Gideon said. He had been silent, pacing the dirt floor. He stopped. His face was grim. He looked at Hank, at Nora, at Sarah. "No," Gideon said. "My ranch is gone. My home. He did that. He burned it because he thought I was weak and alone." He looked at the small group. "He was wrong." "What are you saying?" "Gideon," Nora asked. "He's the law. He's the sheriff. He wraps himself in that star. He uses it as a shield, so we're going to use it as a weapon." Gideon looked at them, his plan forming, sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass. "We're not running to Laramie. We're staying in Ash Mesa. We're calling a town meeting, a community hearing, in the church, this Sunday." "That's madness," Sarah whispered. "He'll arrest us all." "On what charge?" Gideon countered. "He's the one who's been telling everyone he's hunting a dangerous criminal. He's been telling them he's the picture of law and order." He smiled. A cold, thin smile. He can't refuse, not in public. It would be an admission of guilt. His own honor, his own pride, won't let him. "It's a trap, Gideon," Hank said. "He'll bring his men." "I know," Gideon said. "And we'll bring ours." Hank looked at his own massive hands. "What ours? It's us, a smith, a saloon keeper, a postmistress, a broke rancher, and a wounded girl." "It's the miners," Gideon said. "The ones who wrote those letters. It's the ranchers, like the Millers, who lost their farms. It's every person in that valley he stepped on. We'll hold the hearing, and we'll show them. We'll show them the bullet. We'll show them the seal. We'll show them the letters. And Nora, you'll show them the magic." The idea spread from that smithy like fire in dry grass. Hank Calder rode to the Sweetwater mine, his face grim, and spoke to the night shift, Sarah Bloom. She just did her job. She started delivering the mail, and with every letter, she added a whisper, "Sunday, at the church, for the truth." Nora Pike told the ranchers who came in for supplies, her voice low, her eyes steady. By Saturday, all of Ash Mesa was buzzing. The miners, faces gaunt with coal dust and fear, were sharpening their picks. The farmers, who had nothing left but their names, were oiling their father's old shotguns. The wives of the soldiers, the widows, the shopkeepers, they were all watching and waiting. They came, not as a mob, but as a congregation, trickling into town, filling the boarding houses, sleeping in their wagons. They carried candles for the light, and they carried their tools for the work. The news reached Kincaid. He was seen at the telegraph office, his face a thundercloud. He was not a man to be cornered. His response was swift. On Saturday afternoon, a flat car of the Union Pacific Railroad Patrol arrived. 20 men, armed with new rifles, their uniforms clean, their faces hard. They were not lawmen. They were company men. Kincaid announced it himself. In the saloon, "There's been talk of unrest, agitators. I've asked for the railroad's help in ensuring order for our little town meeting, for public safety." The threat was clear. It was not a hearing. It was a powder keg. Sunday morning. The air was cold and still. Cassidy was weak, the journey and the tension having sapped her. She was pale, but her eyes were bright. "I have to be there," she said, as Gideon helped her to her feet in the smithy. "I have to speak." Gideon looked at her. She was a ruin, but she was the strongest person he had ever met. He went to his mule's pack and pulled out the last thing he owned that was not in ashes. It was his father's old duster coat. It was leather, stiff with age, smelling of wool and wood smoke. He did not say anything. He just draped it over her shoulders, covering the thin blanket, covering the bandages. It was an act of protection, a silent, public-facing promise. He put his hand on her arm, his calloused fingers firm. "We stand together," she nodded, pulling the heavy coat tight. From the center of town, a new sound cut through the silence. It was not a gunshot. It was not a shout. It was a bell, slow, steady, solemn. Dong, dong, dong. Reverend Ellery, the town's quiet, book-obsessed pastor, was ringing the church bell. He was calling his flock. "It's time," Nora said, checking the load in her shotgun. Gideon opened the smithy door. The sunlight streamed in. Ash Mesa was waiting for its long, sleepless night. The storm had officially arrived. That Saturday night. Ash Mesa did not sleep. It was a town holding its breath. The railroad men, Kincaid's hired guns, patrolled the main street, their boot heels loud and arrogant on the boardwalks. The miners and ranchers who had gathered for the hearing were silent, watchful shadows in the alleys and boarding houses. Nora Pike, ever practical, had not left Cassidy in the smithy, which was too exposed. She had moved her and Gideon to the hay warehouse behind her saloon. It was a temporary fortress, defensible, with a solid door and one high window. It was filled with the scent of sweet, dry straw and the dust of a long summer. They were not alone. Hank Calder sat on a hay bale by the door, his arms crossed, a shotgun across his lap. But he was, in his own way, 1,000 miles away, giving them the illusion of privacy. A single lantern cast a low, golden light, making the shadows deep. Cassidy was sitting on a pile of feed sacks, the ledger copies and letters resting in the oilcloth pouch on her lap. She was going over the plan, but her hands were shaking. A slight fever, from the strain and the still healing wound, had returned, bringing a chill with it. She shivered, pulling Gideon's father's heavy coat tighter. Gideon was across from her, cleaning his rifle, an action that was more about his hands than the weapon. He saw her shiver. He heard the catch of her breath, the small, involuntary tremor. He stopped his work. He put the rifle down. He moved to her, not with the quick, urgent movements of their flight, but slowly, deliberately. He knelt in the straw in front of her. "You're cold," he said. It was not a question. "I'm all right," she lied, her voice thin. She shivered again, a violent, full-body tremor that rattled her. Gideon reached out, not to the coat, not to her shoulder, but to her hand. He laid his own over it. His hand was huge, rough, the knuckles scarred from a life of fighting fences and rock. He did not grab her. He just covered her hand with his, and then his thumb found her wrist, just below the cuff, and settled on her pulse. It was racing, a panicked bird trapped in her veins. He felt the frantic beat against the calloused pad of his thumb. He felt the heat of her skin, dry and too warm. He just held her, steadying her, his touch a silent anchor. Cassidy looked at his hand, at the contrast of his dark, rough skin against her pale, ink-stained fingers. She looked at his face, lit from below by the lantern, all harsh angles and deep-set, worried eyes. The shaking did not stop, but it changed. It was no longer just the chill. A new tremor, born of exhaustion and a feeling she had no name for, ran through her. She was so tired. She had been so strong, for so long. Without a word, she leaned forward. She did not fall. She moved with purpose. She rested her forehead against his chest, right on the center of his breastbone. She closed her eyes. He went perfectly still. He smelled of sweat, pine resin from the trees in the canyon, and the faint, metallic tang of his rifle. He was solid. He was real. She felt the slow, steady thud of his heart beneath her forehead, a rhythm that was the opposite of her own. For a long moment, they stayed like that, him kneeling, her leaning, connected by his hand on her pulse and her head on his chest. Then, slowly, his other hand, the one that had been resting on his knee, came up. He laid it on her back, on the heavy leather coat, right over her bandaged shoulder. His hand was broad, heavy. He did not pat her. He did not stroke her. He just placed it there, a declaration, a simple pressure that said, "I am here. I am not moving. You are not alone in this." He felt her take a single, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half sigh, and then she was still. He could feel her breath, warm against the thin cotton of his shirt. He tilted his head down, his chin brushing the top of her matted hair. She smelled of straw and sage from the water he'd boiled, and a faint, clean scent that was just her. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. Her face was inches from his. Her eyes, those whiskey brown eyes, were no longer sharp. They were wide and vulnerable, and they were looking right into him. He saw her gaze drop to his mouth. He saw her gaze lift back to his eyes. It was a question. His own breath caught. His hand on her wrist tightened, his thumb stroking. Once, against her racing pulse, he leaned in. She met him, lifting her chin. It was not the kiss he had imagined. There was no imagining in it. It was a fact. Her lips were chapped and hot from the fever. His were dry and tasted of coffee. It was a hesitant touch, a question and an answer. And then, it was a decision. She let out a small sound, a release of all the tension, all the fear. He deepened the kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, not of fire. It was a kiss of ballast. It was a kiss of commitment. It was slow and deep and gentle. It was a promise, made in the dark, before the battle. It was a way of saying, "We are alive, right now, in this moment. We are alive." Her free hand, the one he was not holding, came up. It did not go to his shoulder or his chest. It went to the back of his neck. Her fingers threaded into his hair, a surprisingly gentle, possessive grip. Her thumb, moving on its own, found a small, raised line of scar tissue just behind his ear. She traced it over and over as he kissed her. He pulled back, but only an inch. They stayed where they were, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. His hand was still on her shoulder, his other hand still covering hers, her pulse still hammering. He gave a low, rough laugh. It was a sound rusty from disuse. "When you stood up," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Back at the ranch, when you stood in that doorway, with my rifle, and stared down Kinsid, and you didn't even blink." He closed his eyes. "My heart was decided, right then." She swallowed, her throat tight. Her thumb was still on his scar. When you lit that fire," she whispered back, her voice just as rough. "When you threw your home away, burned it all down, just to get me out." She opened her eyes, and he saw the tears finally well up. "That was when I knew. Home is not a place. It's a person. It's a who." He did not have words for that. He was a man of fences and wood, not words. So he just closed the distance between them. He did not kiss her again. He just wrapped his arms around her, pulling her off the feed sacks and into him, burying his face in her hair. She wrapped her one good arm around his waist, her hand clutching the back of his shirt, and she held on. They just held each other. For a minute, maybe more. There was no light, no grace. It was just two people, clinging to each other in a hay-scented warehouse. It was the warmth of her fevered skin. It was the steady beat of his heart. It was the damp sweat on their brows. It was everything. Then, the reality returned, as it always does. She was the first to pull away, her breath shuddering. She wiped her face with her sleeve, a practical, angry gesture at her own tears. She looked at the oilcloth pouch on the floor. We should check the papers," she said, her voice thick. One more time. Gideon nodded. The moment was over. The spell was broken. Love on the frontier was not silk sheets. It was standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the hilt. It was checking the ammunition and checking the proof. He released her, and the cold air of the warehouse rushed in between them. Cassidy sat back down. She sniffled once, then tucked a stray, sweat-dampened piece of hair behind her ear. When she looked up, her gaze was clear again. The softness was gone, replaced by the sharp, analytical mind he had come to depend on. She was calm. Gideon's heart ached. He stood. He saw that her bandage had slipped, a small, dark stain showing on the white cloth of her shoulder. He went to the small pack Nora had left, got a strip of clean cloth. He knelt in front of her again, but this time, it was business. "Let me," he said. She turned her back to him, letting the heavy duster slip. He untied the knot, his rough fingers surprisingly deft. He folded a new pad, placed it over the wound, and tied the knot, pulling it firm. He then pulled the duster back up, settling the heavy leather on her shoulders, his hands lingering. "Just for a second. It will hold," he said. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "It will." They opened the pouch. They laid the carbon copies, the stolen letters, the land patent, and the small, marked bullet on the floor between them. Hank called her, by the door, cleared his throat. "It's almost dawn." Gideon and Cassidy looked at each other. They stood up, together. They did not touch. They did not need to. Gideon picked up his rifle. Cassidy picked up the pouch. They walked to the door. Hank slid the heavy bar open. The first cold gray light of Sunday morning spilled into the warehouse. They stepped out into the alley, side by side, their shoulders almost touching. They knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that the dawn would demand a terrible price, and they were ready to pay it. The church was not a large building, but that day, it felt as vast and as solemn as a cathedral. It was also, Gideon thought, a perfect trap. It was packed. Every pew was full. The aisles were standing room only, and the doorways were clogged with faces. They were miners, their faces scrubbed clean, but the coal dust still in their creases. They were ranchers, their wives, their children, all in their Sunday best, which for most was just their cleanest work clothes. They were silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. The only sound was the rustle of 100 people breathing, a collective, held breath. And outside, they were hemmed in. The railroad patrol, 20 men strong, stood in a loose, casual line around the churchyard, their rifles held at ease. It was not a guard of honor. It was a fence made of guns. Reverend Ellery stood at the pulpit, a small, bird-like man, his face pale. He looked out at his congregation, at the unlit candles they held in their hands, and he wrung his own. "This," he began, his voice trembling, "is a house of God, but it is also a house of the people. We are gathered to hear testimony, not as a court of law, but as a community, as a conscience." The main door at the back of the church swung open with a bang. Sheriff Mort Kincaid walked in. He was immaculate. His black coat was brushed, his silver star polished to a mirror shine, his boots gleaming. He was smiling, that thin, white, blade-like smile. He was not alone. His two deputies, the heavy-set one and the twitchy one, flanked him, their hands on their gun belts. Kincaid walked slowly down the center aisle, as if he were the groom at a wedding. He nodded to people he knew, people who owed him money, people whose land he now owned. They flinched or looked away. He loved it. He stopped at the front pew, which had been left empty. He gets to his deputies, who sat, and then he sat himself, crossing his legs, the picture of casual authority. He looked up at the pulpit, at Gideon, Cassidy, Hank, Nora, and Sarah, who were standing to the side. "Well, Reverend," Kincaid's voice boomed in the small space, "you have your meeting. I'm here, as your sheriff, to ensure it remains orderly." He smiled. "Please, proceed. I'm fascinated." Gideon looked at Cassidy. Her face was as white as paper. He had put his father's coat on her, and it swallowed her, but her shoulders were straight. He touched her elbow. A small, firm pressure. She looked at him, and he saw the fear, but he also saw the fire. She nodded. She stepped forward. She was holding the oilcloth pouch. "My name is Cassidy Vale," she said, her voice small, but it carried in the silence. It was the only sound. "I was a clerk for the Northern Wyoming Mining Company. I kept the books." Kincaid leaned forward, a look of mock sympathy on his face. "Miss Vale, this is not the place for a confession, but if you're ready to admit to your part in the $50,000 payroll robbery, I'm here." Cassidy cut him off, her voice suddenly strong. "To talk about a different robbery. Sheriff, the one you and Silas Rudd are committing against this entire valley." A gasp, a murmur, like wind in dry leaves. Kincaid's smile did not waver, but his eyes went flat, cold. "I have here," Cassidy said, her hands shaking so hard she could barely open the pouch. "The mine's private ledger, or rather, a copy." Nora Pike stepped forward, a smug look on her face, and handed Cassidy a black, flimsy sheet. "This is a carbon paper copy," Cassidy said, holding it up. "Of a page, mister. Rudd never thought would see the light of day." She walked to the first pew. She held it out to the Miller family, the ranchers who had been Kincaid's first victims. "Mrs. Miller, you lost your farm on the 10th of April. For back taxes," he said. Mrs. Miller, a woman worn down to bone, nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Look here," Cassidy said, her finger on the page. "April 9th, the day before. A payment from the mine to Sheriff Kincaid, $5,000. The line item reads, 'For security and order.'" A low growl rumbled through the pews. "And here," Cassidy said, her voice rising, "is the payment for the security detail that ran the Shoshone off the Broken Horn Reservation. And here, the consulting fee paid the day the widow Del Oro's land was condemned." "These are lies," Kincaid shouted, standing up. "Slander from a wanted criminal. She faked these." "Did she fake the mail, too?" Sarah Bloom shrieked, her terror making her bold. She ran forward, clutching the 3 letters. He made me hold the mail. Letters to the marshal, cries for help. He's been stopping the mail." She threw the letters on the pulpit. They landed like dead birds. The crowd was on its feet. The murmur was becoming a roar. "Order," Kincaid bellowed, his hand on his gun. "Reverend, control your people. Now, Sheriff." Hank Calder's voice rumbled, cutting through the noise. He walked forward, his footsteps heavy enough to shake the floor. In each of his massive hands, he held a metal seal. "No need to get upset. We're just comparing." He placed the 2 seals on the altar, which served as a makeshift table. He took a stick of red wax from his pocket and a candle from the altar. He lit it. "A simple thing. A seal," Hank said to the crowd, his voice easy, as if he were explaining a horseshoe. "It's a mark of authority, of truth." He dripped a pool of red wax onto the altar. "Now, Kincaid, he's a fine man, a fancy man. He broke his first seal, the real county seal." He pressed the first seal into the wax. "He came to me to make a new one." He dripped a second pool of wax. "And I did A fine one. Perfect. He pressed the second seal into the wax. He held the candle up, letting the light shine on the two impressions. They look the same, don't they? Hank said. The crowd surged forward, craning their necks. Almost, but I'm a good smith. Maybe too good. The new one. It's perfect. Smooth. Not a flaw. He pointed to the first impression. But the original, the one he was supposed to destroy, it had a flaw. A tiny hairline crack, right in the eagle's wing. A crack that shows up. He pointed to the red wax. There it was. A tiny, dark line in the impression from the first seal. The second impression, Kincaid's, was flawless. Every paper he has signed, Hank said, his voice dropping. Every land seizure, every tax, for the last 6 months, he has signed with a forgery, with a lie. The church exploded, not in violence, but in sound. A collective roar of betrayal. It's a trick, the twitchy deputy yelled, drawing his gun, but Nora Pike was there, and the twin barrels of her shotgun were aimed right at his stomach. He froze. And what about this, Kincaid? Gideon's voice was quiet, but it cut through the din. He had not moved. He just stood, watching. Now, he stepped forward. He held up his hand. Something small and dark was in his palm. I found this, he said, in a cedar tree near the Wind River crossing, where Miss Vale was ambushed, where the payroll was supposedly stolen. He dropped it on the altar. It was the bullet. It's a .44 inches, Gideon said. Custom filed. With a K on the base. Kincaid's face, for the first time, was no longer smiling. It was a mask of pure, white-hot hatred. He was looking at Gideon as if he were a dead man. That's it, a voice cried from the back. A miner. His face a mask of coal dust, pushed his way forward. I was there. I was driving the wagon when they shot Joe. He was weeping. I saw the bullets. In the wagon bed, they were marked just like that. He was shooting his own men. This is a lie, Kincaid roared, his voice cracking. All of it. It's a conspiracy. A poor man's rebellion. You're all just jealous. You're dirt. You have nothing. We have our names, a woman's voice said, clear and cold. It was the widow Del Oro, a woman Kincaid had run out of her own home. She was standing in the aisle, her back ramrod straight. She was holding a single piece of paper. And you, she said, her voice shaking with a terrible, cold fury, made me sign this one, the one that took my home, the one. She held it up, with your perfect new seal. The crowd surged. It was over. The dam of fear had broken, and a flood of rage was in its place. Men were shouting, women were crying. They were not a mob, not yet. They were a jury, and they had delivered their verdict. Reverend Ellery was hammering on the pulpit with his gavel, a piece of firewood. Please, please, this is not a court. You're right, Reverend, Gideon said, his voice ringing. It's a conscience, and the conscience has spoken. Kincaid was trapped. He was standing in the aisle, his deputies on either side, the crowd pressing in. His face was no longer white. It was a dark, mottled red. He was cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. He looked past Gideon. He looked at the main door. He did not shout. He did not need to. He simply, almost casually, lifted his chin. A nod. A signal. Outside, in the churchyard, one of the railroad patrolmen who had been watching nodded back. He dropped his cigarette. He pulled a small, gray cylinder from his belt. He lit the fuse with a match, and with a lazy, underhand toss, he threw it. It sailed through the open front door of the church. It landed in the center aisle, skittering, spewing thick, yellow-green smoke, a canister of military tear gas. The effect was instantaneous. It was not a fire. It was a poison. The smoke exploded, filling the church in seconds. People screamed, not in rage, but in pure, blind panic. The choking, acrid smoke burned their lungs, blinded their eyes. Run! Fire! We're trapped! The crowd, which had been a jury, became a mob, a terrified herd, all surging for the small side doors, choking, gagging, falling over the pews. Gideon grabbed Cassidy. "The side door, go!" But in the chaos, in the swirling, yellow-green fog, a figure moved. Kincaid. He was not running from the gas. He was using it. His eyes were streaming, but he was moving, not toward the door, but toward the altar, toward the evidence, toward the pouch. Cassidy saw him. She saw his hand lunge for the oilcloth pouch. "No!" she screamed, and she did not run. She leaped forward, grabbing the pouch, pulling it from his grasp. "Setting!" Kincaid snarled. A low, animal sound, and he grabbed her. He grabbed her by her wounded shoulder. She screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing sound, as his fingers dug into the bandages, into the seared, raw flesh. Gideon saw it. Through the smoke, he saw the man in the silver star, his face a mask of fury. With his hands on Cassidy, he did not shout. He did not think. He just moved. He crossed the 10 feet in 2 strides, a low, silent shadow in the chaos, and he hit Mort Kincaid with all the force of a man who had lost his home, his past, and his patience. He hit him with his shoulder, a low tackle that took the sheriff in the ribs, lifting him clean off his feet and sending both of them crashing, not onto the floor, but over the altar, scattering candles, bullets, and forged seals into the choking, blinding smoke. The church was a vortex of screaming, choking blindness. The yellow smoke was thick as wool, stinging, acrid. People trampled each other, fighting for the small side doors, their panic a tangible force. Gideon hit Kincaid, and the world dissolved into a tangle of limbs, vestments, and splintered wood. They crashed over the altar, scattering the evidence, the bullet, the seals, the letters. Kincaid was strong, a brawler beneath the tailored suit. He gouged at Gideon's eyes, but Gideon was driven by a pure, cold rage. He slammed his fist into Kincaid's side. Once, twice. "Fire, fire!" a voice shrieked outside. Through the chaos, a new sound cut the air, the church bell, ringing. Not a slow, solemn toll, but a frantic, clanging alarm. Clang, 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 fast and desperate. Reverend Ellery, or maybe Nora, using the only voice that could be heard over the panic, sowing more confusion to cover their escape. "Gideon!" Cassidy's voice, a pained cry. He looked up. Kincaid's twitchy deputy was lunging for her, his eyes red and streaming. Gideon roared, shoving Kincaid off him. He grabbed the only thing he could reach, the heavy wooden cross from the altar, and swung it like a club, connecting with the deputy's chest. The man went down, his head striking a pew. "The pouch!" Gideon yelled, his eyes burning. "Got it!" Cassidy had scrambled. Grabbing the oilcloth pouch from the floor, Gideon grabbed her hand. "This way, the vestry!" He dragged her through a small, low door behind the pulpit, a door he knew from his childhood. They burst out into the clean, cold sunlight of the churchyard, their lungs on fire, their eyes streaming. The yard was chaos. The railroad patrol was trying to form a line, but the townsfolk, pouring from the church, were a panicked, leaderless mob. "The horses behind the crypt!" Gideon pulled her. They had stashed the mule and a fresh horse Hank had provided in the small, walled cemetery behind the church. They scrambled onto their mounts, Gideon on the horse, Cassidy on the mule. A figure burst from the side door of the church, his face black with soot, his silver star askew. It was Kincaid. He saw them. "Stop them!" he bellowed, his voice a raw hacksaw. "Shoot them, $100. Shoot them now!" He fired his own pistol. The bullet whined past Gideon's ear, so close it felt like a hot poker. "Ride!" Gideon yelled. He slapped the mule's rump, and they charged out of the cemetery, scattering the terrified townsfolk, and pointed their animals west, toward the canyons. They flew down the main street. Behind them, they heard the thunder of hooves. Kincaid, the heavy-set deputy, and another man, one of the hooked shoe bounty hunters, were on their horses, fresh and fast. "They're gaining!" Cassidy cried, kicking the mule, which was already at its full, plodding gallop. "He can't follow where we're going," Gideon shouted. "Dry needle on my lead." He cut left, off the main trail, and into a narrow, rocky wash that seemed to lead nowhere. It was a brutal, jarring ride. Sparks flew as the horse's iron shoes struck the flinty rocks. Kincaid and his men were just 30 yards behind, their shots ricocheting off the canyon walls. "This is a box canyon." "Mar," Kincaid's voice echoed. "You're dead! You're dead!" "He's right!" Cassidy screamed, her face pale. "It's a dead end." The canyon walls narrowed, and ahead of them was a sheer 100-foot drop. A chasm. "No, it's not!" Gideon yelled. Spanning the chasm was a terrible, swaying thing. An old, rotten miner's bridge, made of wooden planks and frayed rope. "Gideon, no!" Cassidy cried. "It'll hold," he lied. "Go, don't stop, don't look down." He slammed his horse's flank, and the animal, sensing the terror, leaped onto the bridge. The planks groaned, some of them snapping, revealing the dizzying drop below. Cassidy's mule followed, its small hooves punching clean through the rotten wood in 2 places. But it kept its footing. They were across. They scrambled onto the solid rock of the other side, gasping. Behind them, Kincaid and his men thundered toward the bridge. "Now!" Gideon yelled. He was already off his horse. He unstrapped the small, sharp hatchet he always carried on his saddle. He ran back to the edge. Kincaid was on the bridge. He was not slowing down. He was coming, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage, his pistol in his hand. "You're mine! Mar!" he screamed. Gideon swung the hatchet. He did not aim for Kincaid. He aimed for the main anchor rope, the thick, heavy line that held the bridge to the cliff. He swung once. The rope bit, twice. It groaned, strands snapping. Kincaid saw him. His eyes went wide. He tried to pull his horse back, but it was too late. He was committed. With a final, desperate swing, Gideon cut the rope. The bridge did not just fall, it whipped. The tension released, and the entire structure snapped sideways, like a broken whip. The 2 men behind Kincaid were thrown, horses and all, into the canyon. Their screams were short, cut off by the terrible, final crash far below. Kincaid, in a feat of desperate horsemanship, had spurred his horse at the last second. The animal, a powerful charger, made a convulsive leap. It was not enough. The horse hit the far cliff face, its chest striking the rock, and fell, lost in the abyss. But Kincaid had let go. He had jumped, not for the cliff, but for the rope. He was a dark, dangling shape, his hands wrapped around a single, frayed support line, the one Gideon had not cut. He was swinging, 20 feet below them, over a 100-foot drop. Silence. The only sound was the wind, whistling in the canyon, and the ragged, desperate panting of Kincaid. Gideon walked to the edge. He stood, his shadow falling over the man dangling below. Kincaid looked up. His face, streaked with soot and terror, was pathetic. His tailored coat was torn. His silver star was gone, lost to the fall. "Mar!" he choked. His hands, his gloved hands, were slipping on the rope. "Help! Help me! For God's sake, help me!" Gideon looked at him. This was the man who had burned his home. This was the man who had laid his hands on Cassidy. This was the man who had terrorized an entire valley. Gideon had the hatchet in his hand. He could just chop the rope, or he could walk over, stand on Kincaid's fingers, and just wait. It was the perfect revenge. It was justice. It was the end. His boot moved. He placed it on the rock, right above Kincaid's white-knuckled grip. Kincaid's breath hitched. "No, please, Mar, I have money. I'll give you anything." Gideon looked at the man's fingers. He looked at the abyss. Then he looked at Cassidy. She was standing 10 feet away, her face as pale as the moon. The oilcloth pouch clutched to her chest. She was watching him. She was not watching Kincaid. She was watching him. Her eyes were not filled with hate or with triumph. They were just watching, waiting to see who he was, waiting to see if the man who had held her in the dark was the same man who would stand here in the light. That look, that terrible, trusting look, broke him. He could not. He was Gideon Mar. He was not Kincaid. He dropped the hatchet. It clattered on the rocks. He knelt. Kincaid sobbed, a sound of raw, animal relief. "Yes, Mar, yes, pull me up. Gideon, no!" Cassidy's voice was sharp. Gideon looked at her, confused. She was not looking at him. She was uncoiling the rope from his saddle, her hands quick and sure. "Not like that." She stepped to the edge. She looked down at the dangling man. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and cold, ringing in the canyon, "you are still under arrest by the conscience of this community." She threw the loop of the lariat. It uncoiled, landing perfectly, a hoop around Kincaid's chest. "Put this on, or let go. Your choice." Kincaid, weeping, fumbled with the rope, securing it under his arms. "He's too heavy for me," Cassidy said to Gideon. Gideon understood. He nodded. He grabbed the rope. Together, they leaned back, their heels digging in the dirt. They did not pull him up with mercy. They pulled him up like a sack of grain, dragging him over the sharp edge of the cliff. Kincaid collapsed on the rock, a gasping, bleeding, ruined man. He was beaten. Gideon did not give him a moment. He was on him, yanking his arms behind his back, tying his wrists with a spare pigging string. It was over. Gideon stood, breathing hard, and began to frisk the man. He was not looking for a weapon. He was looking for a trophy. In Kincaid's inner vest pocket, the one over his heart. Gideon's fingers found it, a small, leather-bound notebook. He pulled it out. He opened it. It was Kincaid's personal ledger. Dates, names, payments. Silas Rudd, the bounty hunters, the railroad assessors. It was all there. The final, damning piece. He held it up. He showed it to Cassidy. She closed her eyes, a single tear of relief cutting a path through the dust on her cheek. And then, they heard it. The thunder of hooves. Gideon spun. Grabbing his rifle, Cassidy staggered to her feet. They were not Kincaid's men. It was the town, riding hard. Up the canyon wash was a wave of people. Hank Calder was in the lead, his smith's hammer in his belt. Nora Pike was beside him on a wagon, her shotgun held high. Reverend Ellery, his face grim. And behind them, the miners, the ranchers, the widows. The conscience of Ash Mesa, come to find its voice. They crested the ridge, saw Gideon and Cassidy, saw the bound man on the ground, and a great, ragged cheer went up. In the distance, the railroad patrol, seeing their leader captured, seeing the entire town armed and unified, and with no one left to give them orders, lowered their rifles, one by one. They unstrapped their gun belts and dropped them in the dust. It was done. Gideon Marr stood on the cliff edge, the wind in his hair, the ledger in his hand. Cassidy Vale stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her head held high, on the red rock plain below. A community, broken by fear, had been welded back together by two people who had refused to run. The Laramie District courtroom was a box of hot, pressed wood, smelling of old dust, fresh sweat, and tobacco. It was not built for a town's worth of people, but the town of Ash Mesa was there. They packed the benches, stood 3 deep against the back wall, and spilled into the hallway. Nora Pike was in the front row, her arms crossed, looking like a queen holding court. Hank Calder sat beside her, his huge frame seeming to take up 2 spots, his face unreadable. Sarah Bloom, the Millers, the widow Del Oro, and a dozen miners. Their faces scrubbed raw, but their knuckles still black, were a silent, watchful jury. At the front, at a defendant's table, sat Mort Kincaid. He was not the same man. His tailored suit was gone, replaced by a prisoner's simple shirt. His face was bruised from the fight in the church, his hands manacled. He stared at the floor, his lips a thin, dry, white line. Beside him, looking slick and untouched in a fine Eastern suit, was Silas Rudd. The territorial marshal had found him on a train to Cheyenne, his bags packed, and had brought him back in chains. Rudd was not looking at the floor. He was glaring at Cassidy, his eyes filled with a cold, reptilian hate. The judge, a man named Harlan, was old, with a beard like white wire and eyes that had seen too much. He sat, not above them, but at a simple pine desk, his gaze moving across the evidence laid out before him. It was a mountain of it, a physical weight of guilt that had been stacked like bricks. Kincaid's private ledger, the carbon copy magic pages from Nora's box, the 3 intercepted letters, now official court exhibits, the small, marked lead bullet, sitting in a metal tray. "We have heard the testimony," Judge Harlan said, his voice a dry rasp that filled the room. "We have heard from Miss Vale, from Mr. Marr, from the postmistress, from the blacksmith. We have heard Mr. Rudd claim these are all forgeries. We have heard Mr. Kincaid say nothing at all." He leaned forward. "This court is not a church meeting. It is not a place for conscience. It is a place for facts. And the facts of this matter appear to rest on a crack." He looked at Hank Calder. "Mr. Calder, if you would." Hank stood. The room went dead silent. He walked to the judge's desk. The judge pushed a stick of red wax and a lit candle toward him. "Show me. Show the court." Hank did not speak. He dripped a pool of red, bubbling wax onto a wooden board. Then, a second pool. He took the original, cracked county seal, the one he had kept, and pressed it firmly into the first pool. He held it for a count of 5. He lifted. He then took the perfect seal, the one he had made for Kincaid, and pressed it into the second pool. He stepped back. The judge put on his spectacles. He leaned over the desk, peering at the 2 impressions. The silence in the courtroom was so total. Gideon could hear the sound of the candle flame. "Bailiff," the judge said, not looking up. "Pass this to the good people. Pass it to Mr. Rudd." The bailiff carried the board. He showed it to the first row. A gasp from Mrs. "Miller. He showed it to the press. A single reporter from the Laramie Boomerang?" The man's eyes went wide, and he began scribbling. He showed it to Silas Rudd. Rudd glanced at it, bored, and waved it away. "You are not impressed?" "Mr. Rudd?" the judge asked. "It is a parlor trick," Rudd said, his voice smooth. "A blacksmith's little game. It proves nothing. The woman is a thief. She stole $50,000. "She did not," Cassidy said. Her voice was clear. Not loud, but it cut through Rudd's oily tone. She was standing with Gideon, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked thin in a borrowed dress from Nora, but her eyes were clear. "She is a clerk," Rudd sneered. "I am a very good clerk," Cassidy said. "I did not just copy your ledgers. Mr. Rudd, I copied your bank transfers." She stepped forward and placed a new, thin sheaf of papers on the judge's desk. "These," she said, "are the drafts from your personal accounts in Cheyenne. The transfers of, let's see, $20,000, then $30,000, all sent to a private account held by Mr. Mort Kincaid. The transfers were completed 2 days before the payroll robbery. You did not just have him on your payroll. You were partners. You did not steal the company's money. You stole your own. You just needed a story and a scapegoat to cover the tracks." Silas Rudd's face went from arrogant to confused to a pale, sickly gray. He had been so busy watching the ledger, he had forgotten about the bank. Judge Harlan looked at the bank drafts. He looked at Kincaid's private ledger. He looked at the carbon copies. He saw the dates and the numbers and how they lined up, as neat as a row of coffins. He leaned back. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, his voice soft. Kincaid, who had been staring at the floor, slowly looked up. His eyes were dead. "Mr. Kincaid," the judge said, his voice rising. "You have betrayed your badge. You have betrayed your office. You have terrorized the people you swore to protect. You have perverted the law into a weapon of theft. You are a disgrace." Kincaid did not speak. He just lowered his head, his chin touching his chest. His lips, Gideon saw, were pressed so tight they had vanished. He was a man, hollowed out, his string cut. The verdict was a formality. The sentencing was a firestorm. The judge, his voice shaking with a cold rage, nullified every single document, every warrant, every land seizure. that had been stamped with the fraudulent seal. "The Miller farm is restored to the Miller family," he declared. The sound from Mrs. Miller was a choked sob of joy. "The Del Oro property is restored to the widow Del Oro. All back taxes seized by Mr. Kincaid are declared illegal theft." He turned his gaze on the mining company's lawyers. "And this court orders full restitution to the families of the men murdered in the payroll charade, to the miners whose wages were stolen." He looked at Cassidy. "And to Miss Cassidy Vale, all charges against you are dismissed, with this court's deepest apologies. Your good name and your honor are fully restored." In the back of the courtroom, a single miner stood up. He started to clap. It was a slow, calloused, pounding sound. Then another miner stood, and another. Hank, Nora. The entire room, save for the railroad lawyers, was on its feet, the applause a thunderous, rolling wave that washed away 6 months of fear and silence. Cassidy stood in the middle of it, her hand gripping Gideon's, and she wept. It was almost over. "And finally," the judge said, the room quieting, "Mr. Gideon Marr." Gideon, startled, looked up. "Mr. Marr, your home was destroyed in the apprehension of this criminal. An act, I am told, of Mr. Kincaid's frustration. The territory thanks you for your service." The judge looked down. "The court, however, has little to offer in restitution for a life's work turned to ash. What can we do for you?" Gideon had not thought of this. He looked at Cassidy, at Nora. He thought of the blackened timbers, the lost tintype of his wife. "Nothing, Your Honor," Gideon said, his voice rough. We just wanted the truth. We just wanted home." "Home," the judge repeated. He was looking at the old maps, the original land patent Gideon had filed as evidence. "Home and water. It says here your patent. It never included the water rights for the Painted Rock Spring. An oversight, it seems." He dipped his pen. "The court and the territory abhors an oversight." He signed a document. He stamped it with his own official Laramie District seal. "The water rights for the Painted Rock Spring are hereby and forever granted to Gideon Marr and his heirs," the judge said, "as a small token of a large debt." Gideon stared. Water. In Wyoming. Water was not just life. It was wealth. It was a future. It was a gift that meant more than all the gold in Rudd's bank account. The courtroom emptied into the bright Laramie sun. It was a celebration. People were hugging, crying, laughing. Nora Pike had produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere and was passing it to Hank, who was already planning the Millers' new barn raising. Gideon and Cassidy stood apart from it, standing under the wooden porch of the land office next door, the noise and joy a happy, buzzing sound around them. He was quiet. He had been quiet the whole ride back. She looked at him, at his profile, at the way the sun lit the lines around his eyes. "Gideon," she said, "are you all right?" He looked at her. His hand was in his pocket, fumbling with something. "When I was mending that saddle," he said, his voice low, "the day you arrived, I was saving the scraps. Good leather is hard to come by." He pulled his hand out. He was holding a small, tightly braided loop. It was dark, oiled leather made of 4 thin strands, woven into a circle. I'm not a rich man, Cassidy," he said, his voice rougher than he wanted. "My home is ash. I've got a mule and a patent, and now I have water. I don't have a ring. I don't have gold." He held out the small, braided loop, laying it on his scarred palm. "I only have this," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "It's just something that ties fast, something for what you don't ever want to lose." Cassidy looked at the small, humble, beautiful ring of leather. She looked at his face, at the desperate hope and the fear. In his eyes, her face, which had been so pale with worry, broke into a smile. It was not a small smile. It was a smile that lit up her whole face, that brought the whiskey brown of her eyes to life, as bright as the sun hitting the valley floor. She did not hold out her finger. She held out her arm, her wrist. "Then tie it to what we saved," she said, her voice soft. Gideon's breath hitched. His calloused, shaking fingers picked up the loop. He did not know what to do. She laughed. A real, full laugh. Here. She guided his hands. He slipped the leather loop over her hand. It was too big for a ring, but it fit her wrist perfectly. He pulled the small, sliding knot, the one he had made, and drew it tight. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was a brand, a promise, a tether. Gideon Marr, she said, her voice thick. It's the most beautiful. She was cut off. A piercing, ear-splitting whistle, the kind that calls dogs and stops bar fights, sliced the air. Nora Pike was standing on the boardwalk, a grin splitting her face, her fingers in her mouth. Well, it's about time. You slow-footed fool, she roared at Gideon. Hank Calder, who was standing next to a hitching post, looked over. He saw Gideon's hand, still on Cassidy's wrist. He saw the leather braid. A slow, massive grin spread across his soot-stained face. He unhooked a heavy iron anvil weight from a wagon. He was a smith. He had no bell. He had a hammer. He struck the anvil weight, and the sound rang out. A pure, high, metal clang that was clearer than any church bell. Clang, clang, clang. The crowd, the miners, the ranchers, the widows, they all turned. They saw, and a cheer went up, a great, ragged, human roar. It was not a polite, whispered wedding. It was a border town celebration. It was loud and rough and real. It was the sound of a family, not born of blood, but forged in fire and truth. They returned to Painted Rock. That was the first thing they did. It was not a homecoming. It was a funeral. They stood on the ridge, the mule and the horse side by side, and looked down at the ruin. The cabin, his home, was a pile of blackened, smoking timbers. The chimney stood, a lone, stubborn monument of stone in a sea of ash. The barn was gone. The fences were gone. Even the air smelled of defeat, a bitter, acrid char that stung the throat. Gideon had expected to feel anger. He had expected to feel that cold, hard rage that had carried him through the fight. He felt nothing. He just felt empty. He was a man with no anchor. He started to walk down the hill, his boots crunching on the brittle, burnt grass. He felt a hand slide into his... He stopped. He looked. Cassidy was beside him, her small, ink-stained hand solid in his scarred, rough one. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair a wild tangle, the heavy leather coat still on her shoulders. She was not looking at the ruin. She was looking at him. She did not say, "We can rebuild." She did not say, "It will be all right." She just held his hand and squeezed, and the emptiness, the cold, hollow space found a new center. He squeezed back. He let go of the past. He took a breath. "Well," Gideon said, his voice a low rasp. "The foundation looks solid. They did not rebuild alone." The next morning, as they were sifting through the ash, trying to salvage a single skillet, a single tool, they heard a sound, a wagon, then another. It was Hank Calder, his wagon loaded with fresh-cut lumber, his face set in a grim, determined line. Behind him was Nora Pike, her wagon loaded with everything. Sacks of flour, coffee, a side of bacon, blankets, 2 new rifles, and a crate of whiskey. Behind her were the Millers, and the widow Del Oro, and 3 miners who had taken the day off. "You're a fool, Gideon Marr," Nora boomed, climbing down from her wagon seat. "If you think we're letting you sleep in a ditch, I can't pay for this." "Nora," Gideon said, stunned, looking at the mountain of supplies. "Pay," Hank Calder grunted, unloading a heavy timber onto his shoulder. "This isn't a bill, you idiot. It's a barn raising. We're just starting with the house." He looked at the burned-out timbers. "Besides, Kincaid burned your house. We're building our house. Now, where do you want the porch?" They worked. For 2 weeks, the valley echoed with the sound of hammers and saws. They raised the cabin first, new and strong, the pine smelling sharp and clean. When they got to the porch, Gideon stopped them. He had salvaged 2 of the main support beams from the old barn, the ones that had been part of the false fire. They were charred, black, and smelled of smoke. "Here," he said. "Use these, for the porch posts." Hank looked at him. "They're ugly. Gideon, they're burned." "I know," Gideon said, running his hand over the blackened, alligator skin texture of the wood. "I want to see them. I want to remember what it cost." So they built the new porch, with its fresh, clean planks. But it was held up by the 2 pillars of black, scorched wood, a badge of honor, a scar. The barn went up next, bigger than the old one. And inside, Cassidy claimed a corner. She had found the children. The Miller children, the miners' children, none of whom had ever seen the inside of a school. She hung a length of rope from one new beam to another, and from it, she hung letters, cut from old sheets of canvas. A, B, C. She convinced Hank to build her 3 long, rough-hewn tables and a dozen small benches. She got a single, precious slate board from Nora, and the Painted Rock Ranch School was opened every afternoon. As Gideon worked the new fences, he would hear her voice, clear and steady, and the high-pitched, piping chorus of children. The cat ran. He had his water. He had his land, and now he had the sound of a future. Right in his own barn, he dug the well himself. With the new water rights, he knew where the springhead was. He dug not with desperation, but with a slow, steady rhythm. He dug through the dry-packed earth, through the rock, and on the 5th day, his shovel hit mud. He pulled out a bucket of water. Not the alkali-laced sludge from the creek. It was clear and cold and sweet. He sat by the wellhead, drank, and looked up at the sky. The new well, a perfect circle of dark, wet stone, reflected the vast, blue Wyoming sky. Like a silver coin, a new start. The first harvest was good. The water made the difference, and with the harvest came the celebration. It was a dance, not a fancy ball. A barn-raising, harvest home dance. The new barn was swept clean. The lanterns were empty bottles, cleaned and polished, with candles stuck in them, casting a warm, golden, flickering light. A miner had a fiddle. A rancher had a concertina. And Nora Pike was calling the steps, her voice booming over the music. The whole valley was there. Gideon stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, watching. He was not a dancer. Cassidy walked up to him. She was wearing the dress Nora had given her, a simple blue calico, and her hair was tied back with a ribbon. The leather braid, his leather braid, was dark on her wrist. "You are," she said, her voice quiet in the noise. "Going to stand there all night and look handsome, or are you going to ask me to dance? Mr. Mar." He looked at her, at the mischief in her eyes, at the woman who had faced down Kincaid, who had taught his children, who was here? He did not know what to do. He just held out his hand. She smiled and took it. She led him to the floor. The music was slow, a simple 3-step waltz. He put his hand on her back. He had never touched a woman like this, not in this way. His hand was rough, calloused, and it covered the center of her back, his thumb resting just on her spine. She was so small and so strong. She put her hand on his shoulder, her fingers light. They moved, and they were perfect. He was not a dancer, but he knew her rhythm. He knew it from the days in the canyon, from the night in the warehouse. Her steps were even. Her weight was light. They moved as one. They did not talk. They did not need to. They just moved. In the golden bottle light, their steps matching the fiddle, their hearts matching each other. Later, long after the music had faded, after the last wagon had rumbled away, they stood outside. The night was clear, the stars so bright they looked like holes punched in the sky. He had built a new fence, and they stood by it, their shoulders almost touching, looking out over the land. "Their land, we need a windbreak," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A line of cottonwoods, right along that ridge. It'll stop the wind. And a bigger pasture," she said, her voice soft. leaning her head against his shoulder. "That southeast 40. If we seed it, we could run. Maybe 50 more head." He smiled. A new, easy smile. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. 50, I was thinking 100. She laughed, a sound that the wind took, but he felt it, a vibration against his ribs. "And," she said, her voice going serious, we need another room on the cabin, a small one." "A new room?" he asked. "Why? For strays," she said. "For the next person who shows up, shot, and needing a place to mend." He stopped. He turned, his hands on her shoulders. He looked down at her face, a pale oval in the starlight. "Cassidy," he said. He was cut off. A sound, a fast, hard-riding horse, coming up the main track. Gideon was instantly tense, his hand moving to the pistol he no longer wore at his hip. "It's just a rider," Cassidy said, her hand on his chest. "It's all right. We're safe here." It was a male rider, a young man on a leathered horse. He pulled up, saw them, and handed Gideon a single, thick envelope. "For Miss Vale, Miss Cassidy Vale, the new school mar." "I am," Cassidy said, surprised. The rider tipped his hat. "From Laramie. From the new Railroad Commission." He was gone in a cloud of dust. They walked up to the porch, to the light of the single lantern they had left burning. Cassidy sat on the step. Gideon stood over her, watching. She broke the wax seal. It was not a forged seal. It was the big, official, territorial one. She read the letter. Gideon watched her face. He saw her eyes go wide. He saw her lips part. He saw her read it a second time. "What is it?" he asked, his stomach cold. "It's Silas Rudd is in prison. The old commission is gone. They're rebuilding. They're offering me a job." "A job," Gideon repeated, his voice flat. A very good one," she said, her voice a whisper. "In Cheyenne, chief comptroller of the Northern Line. They said I'm the only one who knows where all the bodies are buried, where the money is." She looked at the paper. The salary is, Gideon, it's more money than I've ever seen in 1 year." She was quiet. Gideon was quiet. The crickets were a deafening roar in the silence. This was it. The world, the real, rich, important world, had come to claim her. He was a dirt rancher, with a 2-room cabin and a new well. She was a woman who could be important. You should take it," he said, his voice thick. He was a fool to think she would. "It's a good life, an important one. You've earned it." He turned, so she could not see his face. He looked at the black scarred post that held up his porch, his badge of honor. Cassidy stood up. She did not say anything. She just walked over to him. He heard her, but he did not turn. Then he saw her hand. She was folding the letter, slowly, deliberately. She folded it and folded it until it was a small, thick square. She walked past him. She went to the end of the porch. She looked at the scarred, black post. She tucked the letter into a crack in the wood, a small, white square against the black, and she left it there. She walked back to him. She stood in front of him, so close he could feel the heat from her skin. "My home," she said, her voice soft, but as solid as the rock under his feet, "is here." He turned. He looked down at her. His hand came up, his rough, calloused, scarred hand, and he touched her face. He traced the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, the leather braid on her wrist brushing his. He was not a man of words. He was a man of action. He leaned down, and he kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the warehouse. It was not the hurried, questioning kiss of that night. It was slow. It was cautious. It was intense. It was a kiss that had been waiting a lifetime. His hands were on her face, in her hair, and her hands were on his chest, holding his shirt, holding him, their hands entwined, their breath mingled. It was a kiss that did not break the silence of the high plains night. It just warmed it, made it complete. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closed. "Cassidy Marr," he whispered, trying the name. "I like the sound of that." She whispered back, "The sun rose. It always does. It came up over the red rocks of Ash Mesa, bathing the valley in a light that was as red and as bright as new forged iron. And in that light, two small silhouettes stood at a fence line. Behind them was a patched, rebuilt house, held up by scarred wood. It was not pretty. It was not perfect. But it was standing. It was a testament, a monument, to the simple, frontier truth that in the West, you did not need to be rich to find justice, and you did not need to be whole to find love. You just had to be brave enough to not let go. When the storm came, thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm curious. Where are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to connect and hear your thoughts on Gideon and Cassidy's journey. Please, if you enjoyed this, subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and you can support us even more by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by many more folks.